Some people spend their whole lives searching for home, only to find it in the most unexpected place. Others discover that the greatest treasures come not from what we seek, but from what finds us when we're not looking. One autumn evening, Torvin returned from hunting to find a strange woman sitting quietly on his cabin bench. She wore no clan markings and spoke no words. This giant of a man, who had lived alone since losing his family to sickness, made her a simple offer. If you stay quiet, you can stay here. Days turned to weeks in peaceful silence. She tended his fire while he chopped wood. His guarded heart began to soften. But when armed riders arrived searching for a runaway with royal blood and a hefty bounty, everything changed. Torvin faced an impossible choice: turn her over for gold, or protect the unexpected peace she had brought to his lonely world. What happens when a man who's lost everything finally finds something worth fighting for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine needles like memories that refused to fade, and Torvin Eriksson stood at his cabin's threshold, watching steam rise from his clay mug of bitter root tea. 3 winters had passed since he'd buried Astrid and little Magnus beneath the oak tree that overlooked the valley, and still the silence of dawn felt too heavy, too complete. At 42, he carried himself with the measured gait of a man who had learned that hurrying rarely improved anything worth doing. His cabin sat nestled in a clearing where the ancient forest met a gentle slope, far enough from the king's roads that travelers were rare, close enough to the stream that fresh water never failed him. The structure itself spoke of careful hands and patient hours: thick logs fitted tight against harsh winters, a stone chimney that drew smoke clean and true, shutters that held firm against both storm and curious eyes. Torvin had built it all himself, timber by timber, stone by stone. In the months after he'd carried his family from their village and the sickness that had claimed so many, the bench where she had appeared sat beneath the eastern eave, positioned to catch morning sun and evening shadow alike. Torvin had carved it from a single oak trunk during his second winter alone, when the nights had grown so quiet that he needed something to occupy his hands or lose his mind entirely. Its surface bore the gentle wear of 3 seasons. Smooth from his own weight during countless evenings when sleep proved elusive and the stars offered more comfort than dreams, he settled onto it now, as had become his custom, letting the warmth of the tea seep into his calloused palms while his eyes swept the tree line. A man learned to read the forest when he lived alone, which shadows moved with wind and which moved with intent, which sounds belonged to morning and which whispered of danger. This morning, like so many others, brought only the ordinary mysteries of daybreak, an owl's final call, the rustle of some small creature returning home, the distant crack of a branch settling into the day's warmth. Torvin's hands told the story of his 42 years as clearly as any saga sung in great halls. Scars from childhood misadventures traced white lines across his knuckles, while deeper marks spoke of his years following the warbands north of the great river. A puckered circle on his left palm marked where a Saxon arrow had found its mark during a raid that had filled his young purse with silver and his nights with guilt. The calluses came from honest work: axe and saw, hammer and plane. The tools of a man who had learned that creating something lasting mattered more than destroying something temporary. His size had always marked him as different. At 6.5 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and arms thick as young trees, Torvin drew stares in any gathering. His beard, now shot through with premature silver, hung past his collarbone in a thick braid that Astrid had woven for him each morning during their 8 years together. He still braided it himself, though his fingers lacked her gentle touch, because letting it hang loose felt like abandoning one more piece of the life they'd shared. The clothes he wore spoke of practical necessity rather than vanity. Wool tunic dyed the color of forest loam, leather breeches softened by years of wear, boots resoled twice, but still sound enough for mountain paths. A knife hung at his belt, its bone handle polished smooth by constant use, while his great axe rested always within arm's reach. Whether he worked at chopping wood or sat in evening contemplation, memory was a dangerous companion for a man alone. Torvin had learned to keep busy during daylight hours, when the sun could burn away the ghosts that gathered in idle moments. He'd built chicken coops and pig pens he didn't need, carved bowls and spoons far beyond his simple requirements, split enough firewood to last 3 winters instead of 1. Anything to keep his hands moving and his mind anchored to the present moment, rather than drifting toward the oak tree on the hill. But evenings brought their own challenges, when work grew impossible and silence pressed close like an unwelcome guest. He'd tried reading by firelight, working his way through the handful of books that had survived their flight from the village, old stories of gods and heroes, a treatise on herb lore that Astrid had treasured, a collection of poems that Magnus had been learning to sound out with patient determination. The words still held their power, but they carried too much weight of shared evenings. Too many echoes of Astrid's voice reading aloud while Magnus drowsed against her shoulder, so instead he'd taken to sitting on his bench, letting the night sounds wash over him while his mind worked through the practical concerns of tomorrow. The roof needed attention before winter returned in earnest. His traps could use resetting along the deer paths that wound down to the stream. The small garden where he grew turnips and onions would need harvesting soon, though he always planted more than one man could reasonably consume. Hope was a stubborn thing, even in the heart of a man who had learned not to expect much from tomorrow. The axe that leaned against the cabin's eastern wall deserved its own place in any telling of Torvin's story. Forged by his grandfather's father, it bore a name, Treefeller, etched in runes along the iron head. 3 feet of ash handle, worn smooth by generations of Ericsson hands, fitted to 2 pounds of steel that could bite through oak heartwood or split a skull with equal ease. Torvin had carried it through 7 campaigns before he'd ever used it for honest work. And sometimes, in the deep of winter when memories pressed close, he still felt the ghost weight of other men's blood along its edge. That same axe had felled every tree that built his cabin, split every log that warmed his hearth, cleared every inch of ground where he'd tried to scratch a garden from the forest floor. Honest work, he'd learned, had a way of washing old stains clean, though it took time and patience and more than a few nights when sleep came hard despite exhausted muscles. The routine of his days had settled into comfortable predictability. Rise with dawn's first light, tend the fire that never quite died through the night, check his snares and fishing lines before breaking fast with whatever the forest had provided. Mornings meant work, cutting timber, splitting kindling, mending whatever the previous day had broken or worn thin. Afternoons brought hunting or fishing, depending on the season and his larder's needs, while evenings meant preparing whatever he'd caught and setting aside portions for the lean months that would surely come. He'd grown skilled at reading weather, in the way clouds gathered over the western peaks, at judging which mushrooms were safe and which would leave him writhing in poisoned agony, at setting snares that rarely came up empty, and smoking meat that would last through winter's longest nights. These were not skills he'd learned as a young warrior, when other men's labor had filled his belly and kept him warm. These were the hard-earned lessons of a man who had discovered that survival was a skill unto itself, requiring different virtues than those praised in warriors' halls. The loneliness, when it came, struck without warning and with the force of a hammer blow. One moment he'd be absorbed in some necessary task, sharpening his tools or mending a torn tunic, and the next he'd find himself frozen by the weight of silence, the absence of voices that had once filled his world with purpose and warmth. During the first winter alone, these moments had nearly broken him. He'd spent long nights staring into his fire, wondering if the effort of tomorrow was worth the pain of today. But time had taught him tricks for managing the darker hours. When silence grew too heavy, he'd sing the old songs that Astrid had loved, letting his rough voice carry melodies that seemed to push back the shadows. When memories threatened to drown him, he'd work his body past exhaustion, chopping wood until his arms screamed. hauling stones until his back ached, pushing himself to the edge of collapse so that sleep would come without dreams. The seasons had become his calendar, marking time not by kings' reigns or great battles, but by the cycle of planting and harvest, hunting and preservation. The endless rhythm of preparation that kept a man alive when he stood alone against winter's hunger. Spring meant clearing deadfall and setting snares along paths where animals would return from their winter shelters. Summer brought fishing and the brief abundance of berries and wild greens that could stretch his stores through leaner times. Autumn meant hunting in earnest, taking deer and elk and smaller game that could be smoked or salted for the long months ahead. And winter was the true test, when storms could last for days, and the nearest human voice might be a week's hard travel through snow that reached a man's chest. Those were the months when his careful preparations meant the difference between comfort and catastrophe, when every log split in autumn's warmth would ward off winter's bite, when every trap set and every strip of jerky dried could mean another day of survival rather than surrender. His nearest neighbors lived more than a day's walk south, where the land opened into broader valleys and the soil ran rich enough for proper farming. Good people, from what little he knew of them. A family named Bjornsson, who'd offered shelter and supplies when he'd first arrived in the region. But distance and his own nature had kept their interactions limited to brief encounters during his rare trips to the seasonal market where trappers and hunters gathered to trade pelts and meat for tools and grain they couldn't produce themselves. The truth was that Torvin had grown comfortable with solitude in ways that sometimes surprised him. After years of living in the company of war bands and village folk, he'd discovered an unexpected peace in answering to no one but himself, in setting his own pace and following his own rhythms without the constant negotiation that came with sharing space with others. He could sit in silence for hours without feeling the need to fill the quiet with words. He could work through problems at his own speed, thinking matters through without interruption or the pressure of other voices offering advice he hadn't requested. Yet beneath that contentment lay an emptiness that no amount of practical satisfaction could fill entirely. He missed the sound of Astrid humming as she worked, the weight of Magnus curled against his side during long winter evenings, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone who cared whether he'd had a good day or a difficult one. He missed having someone to notice when he'd accomplished something worth noting, someone to help carry the load when problems grew too heavy for one man's shoulders. The bench beneath him creaked softly as he shifted his weight, drawing his attention back to the present moment. Dawn had fully broken while his mind wandered, painting the forest in shades of gold and green that spoke of autumn's slow approach. Soon the leaves would begin their annual surrender to winter, turning from emerald to amber to rust before falling to carpet the forest floor in preparation for the snow that would surely follow. It was then, as he lifted his mug for another sip of cooling tea, that he noticed the figure sitting at the far end of his bench. The woman sat as still as carved stone, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that spoke of long practice at remaining unnoticed. She wore a simple wool dress the color of winter bark, travel-worn but well-made, with sleeves that covered arms marked by old bruises yellowed to the shade of dying leaves. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, dark as a moonless night and tangled from what must have been days of hard travel through forest, paths not meant for gentlefolk. What struck Torvin most deeply was her stillness, not the tense alertness of someone ready to flee, nor the rigid fear of someone expecting violence, but something deeper, a quietness that seemed to come from her very bones. Her eyes remained closed, though he could see the slight movement beneath her lids that suggested she was awake and aware of his presence. Her breathing came slow and measured, as if she'd learned to make herself as small and unremarkable as possible. Torvin set his mug down carefully, the clay making the faintest ring against the wooden bench. The sound might as well have been a thunderclap in the morning quiet, yet the woman didn't flinch. Her stillness remained absolute, though he caught the subtle shift in her breathing that told him she'd registered the sound. whoever she was, wherever she'd come from. She possessed the kind of control that came from necessity rather than choice. He studied her face in the growing light, noting the high cheekbones and straight nose that spoke of noble blood, the kind of features that graced silver coins and royal portraits. Yet her hands, when he glimpsed them beneath her sleeves, bore calluses that told a different story. Someone who'd learned to work despite her breeding. Someone who'd found herself in circumstances that required more than gentle accomplishments. "You're awake," Torvin said quietly, his voice carrying the roughness that came from days of speaking to no one but himself. It wasn't a question. He'd spent too many years reading men's breathing in army camps to mistake true sleep for its careful imitation. The woman's eyes opened slowly, revealing depths the color of storm clouds before rain. She looked at him without the startled fear he might have expected, taking in his size and the weapons within his reach with the calm assessment of someone who'd grown accustomed to evaluating threats. Her gaze lingered on the axe leaning against the cabin wall, then moved to the knife at his belt, before finally settling on his face. "I mean no harm," she said, and her voice carried the cultured tones of someone raised in halls where words were chosen carefully and consequences mattered. "I was traveling through the night and saw your fire. I thought to rest only until dawn." Torvin nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd said. Someone traveling alone through forest paths at night was running from something that made darkness safer than daylight, wolves and bears less dangerous than whatever pursued her. The careful way she spoke, revealing nothing of her destination or her origin, told him she'd had practice at hiding truths behind polite words. "You've been here longer than dawn," he observed, gesturing toward the sun that had climbed well above the tree line while they spoke. "And you chose my bench over the shelter of my hearth. That speaks of someone who doesn't want to be found, even by someone offering help." A smile ghosted across her features, there and gone like sunlight through moving clouds. "You're more observant than most, Goodman." "Yes, I chose the cold over announcing myself. Uninvited guests can bring unwelcome troubles to generous hosts." The admission hung between them like morning mist, present but insubstantial. Torvin found himself studying her more carefully, noting details he'd missed in his first assessment. Her dress, though well-made, showed signs of hasty departure, a torn hem that had been mended with thread that didn't quite match, sleeves that had been shortened recently enough that he could see the original hemline. Most telling were her feet, shod in soft leather slippers that had never been meant for forest travel. Their soles worn through in places that spoke of miles, walked on ground far harder than palace floors. "What's your name?" he asked, though something in her manner made him suspect she wouldn't answer truthfully. She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not respond at all. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of careful decision. "I would rather not say, if that's acceptable to you. Names have power, and mine has brought more trouble than comfort in recent days." Torvin nodded, understanding the wisdom in her caution. In his years following warbands, he'd known men who'd changed their names like they changed their cloaks, leaving old identities behind when those names became burdens rather than blessings. "Then I'll not press you for it. A person's name is their own, to give or keep as they choose." Relief flickered in her storm-grey eyes. "You're kind, kinder than I had any right to expect." "Kindness costs nothing," Torvin replied, though even as he said it, he wondered if that was entirely true. Sometimes kindness extracted prices that only became clear after the debt was due. "But staying here might cost us both more than we can afford. These woods are far from the king's roads, but they're not beyond the reach of men with horses and determination." The woman's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing the fear that lived beneath her careful control. "They're looking for me," she said, the words coming out in a rush before she could reconsider. "Men with swords and silver, asking questions in every village between here and the coast. They have my description, and they're offering enough coin to make even honest folk consider betrayal." Torvin felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd lived in these mountains precisely because they lay far from the kind of troubles that came with royal blood and political complications. The last thing he needed was to find himself caught between whoever this woman was and whoever wanted her badly enough to fund a manhunt across 3 provinces. "What did you do?" he asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "I ran." The answer came without hesitation, but it carried depths that spoke of complexities she wasn't ready to share. Sometimes running is the only honest response to an impossible situation. Torvin understood that wisdom better than she might have expected. He'd run too, in his own way. Run from the memories that made his village unbearable. Run from the well-meaning sympathy of neighbors who couldn't understand that some losses carved wounds too deep for healing. Run from the expectations of a life that no longer fit the man he'd become. "If you stay quiet, you can stay here," he heard himself saying, the words emerging before he'd fully considered their implications. "But understand that my peace is bought with isolation. Visitors bring complications I'm not equipped to handle." She stared at him for a long moment, as if testing the sincerity of his offer against experiences that had taught her to question generous gestures. "You don't know anything about me," she said finally. "I could be anyone. I could bring dangers you can't imagine." "True enough," Torvin admitted. "But you could also be someone who needs help, and I've had enough of turning my back on people who need help. The choice is yours. Stay quiet and you're welcome to what shelter I can offer. But if trouble follows you here, we'll face it together or not at all." The woman nodded slowly, and for the first time since he'd noticed her presence, her shoulders relaxed slightly. "I accept your terms, Goodman, and I thank you for them. My name is Torvin," he said, rising from the bench with a grunt that spoke of muscles stiff from too much sitting. "And if you're staying, there's work to be done. Winter comes, whether we're ready or not, and an extra pair of hands can make the difference between comfort and catastrophe." She stood as well, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. "I'm stronger than I look, and I learn quickly. Whatever needs doing, I'll do my share." Torvin nodded, already thinking through the tasks that 2 people could accomplish more efficiently than one. Firewood to split, meat to smoke, vegetables to harvest and store. Simple work, but essential, and perhaps enough to keep them both too busy to dwell on the questions that hung unasked between them. As he led her toward the cabin, he caught sight of something that made him pause, a small leather pouch that had slipped partially from beneath her dress, revealing the corner of what looked like a seal or medallion, marked with symbols he didn't recognize. Royal symbols, if his guess was correct. Though he'd learned long ago that some knowledge was more dangerous than ignorance, he said nothing about what he'd seen, but filed the observation away for future consideration. Whatever secrets this woman carried, whatever troubles pursued her, they were now his troubles too. For better or worse, his carefully maintained isolation had come to an end. The first 3 days passed in a careful dance of shared tasks and unspoken boundaries. The woman, who still offered no name despite Torvin's gentle inquiries, proved true to her word about learning quickly. She watched him split kindling for half an hour before asking to try the smaller axe herself, and within 2 attempts had found the rhythm that made the work efficient rather than exhausting. Her hands might have been soft when she arrived, but they hardened quickly under honest labor. Torvin found himself adjusting his routines to accommodate another presence without quite meaning to. He rose earlier to give her privacy by the stream where she washed each morning, and he took longer with his evening repairs to allow her time to settle by the fire before he returned to the cabin. These small courtesies felt rusty from disuse, but they came back to him gradually, the half-remembered habits of a man who'd once shared his life with someone who mattered. She worked with an intensity that spoke of someone who understood that usefulness was often the only currency available to the powerless. When he returned from checking his snares on the second morning, he found her kneeling in his garden, carefully harvesting the last turnips and sorting them by size for storage. She'd also gathered the wild herbs that grew along the forest edge, plants he recognized as valuable for preserving meat and treating common ailments. "My mother's cook taught me which plants were worth gathering," she explained when he complimented her selections. She said a woman who understood herbs would never lack for value. Regardless of her other circumstances, it was the first personal detail she'd shared, and Torvin filed it away with growing certainty that her mother's cook had likely served in halls where such knowledge was part of a lady's education rather than necessity. The way she moved her hands when sorting the herbs, precise, economical, confident, spoke of someone who'd been taught proper techniques rather than learning them through trial and error. On the third evening, as they sat by his fire, sharing a meal of rabbit stew and the last of his summer bread, she finally offered something approaching an explanation. "I was to be married," she said quietly, staring into the flames rather than meeting his eyes. "A political arrangement that would have benefited everyone, except the bride." Torvin waited, having learned that silence often encouraged more honesty than questions. The fire crackled and shifted, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls while she gathered her thoughts. The man they chose was wealthy and powerful, with holdings that bordered my father's lands. The alliance would have strengthened both houses and secured peace between regions that have feuded for 3 generations. She paused, her fingers worrying at a loose thread on her dress. He was also cruel in ways that those around him learned to overlook because of his gold and influence. "So you ran," Torvin said, understanding more than she'd said. He'd seen enough of the world to know how such arrangements typically unfolded. Young women traded like livestock to secure advantages for men who viewed marriage as just another form of warfare. "I ran," she confirmed, finally meeting his gaze. "The night before the ceremony, I took what I could carry and fled. My father's men have been hunting me for 2 weeks, along with my intended husband's guards and anyone else who thinks the bounty on my return is worth the risk." Torvin absorbed this information while studying her face in the firelight. The fear was real enough, but there were depths to her story that remained unspoken. Noble daughters who fled unwanted marriages might face pursuit, but the kind of manhunt she'd described suggested stakes higher than family honor and political alliances. "This bounty they're offering," he said carefully, "it must be substantial to motivate so many hunters." Her laugh held no humor. 50 pieces of silver for my safe return. Enough to buy a farm or establish a tradesman for life. Enough to make honest men consider becoming bounty hunters," Torvin whistled softly. It was indeed a fortune, more than most common folk would see in a lifetime of honest work. The kind of sum that suggested whoever wanted her back possessed resources that went far beyond even wealthy nobility. Kings and princes commanded such wealth, along with the kind of power that could reach across provinces and turn ordinary citizens into temporary soldiers. That raises uncomfortable questions about exactly who you're running from, he observed. She was quiet for so long that he thought she might retreat back into her careful silence. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of a confession that cost her something to make. "My father serves the crown directly. The marriage was arranged not just for our family's benefit, but to strengthen certain political alliances that matter to those who rule. My refusal to participate has larger implications than personal happiness." The revelation settled between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond the immediate splash. Torvin had spent the last 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of complexity, the sort of political entanglements that could turn a man's quiet life into a battleground where the innocent suffered alongside the guilty. Yet as he looked at her across the fire, noting the way she held herself ready to flee despite the exhaustion that lined her face, he found that his anger was directed not at her for bringing such troubles to his door, but at the men who'd put her in a position where running into the wilderness seemed like her best option. "The leather pouch you carry," he said quietly. "I glimpsed it that first morning. It bears seals that confirm royal connections, doesn't it?" Her hand moved instinctively to touch the hidden item, then stopped as she realized she'd given herself away. "You're observant," she said, echoing her words from their first conversation. "Yes, it bears proof of my identity and my father's authority. I kept it because—" She hesitated, then continued with visible effort. "Because I may need to prove who I am if circumstances require it." Torvin nodded, understanding the terrible logic of her position. The same symbols that made her valuable to those who hunted her might also be her only protection if she found herself in situations where royal blood commanded respect rather than bounty. "What's your real name?" he asked, though he suspected he might not want to know the answer. She met his eyes with a directness that spoke of a decision made. "Freydis Magnusdottir. My father is Magnus the Red, Earl of Northmark, and counsellor to King Harold himself." The name hit Torvin like a physical blow. Even in his isolation, he'd heard tales of Magnus the Red, a man whose loyalty to the crown was matched only by his ruthlessness toward those who opposed royal will. If this woman was indeed his daughter, then the stakes of harboring her went far beyond personal danger. They were talking about treason, about defying not just an earl's authority, but the will of the king himself. "That changes things," he said quietly. "I know," Freydis replied. "I'll leave in the morning if you wish it." "I never intended to bring such troubles to your door." Torvin stared into the fire, weighing choices that all seemed to carry more risk than reward. Send her away, and she'd likely be caught within days, captured, returned, and forced into a marriage that might destroy her spirit if it didn't kill her outright. Keep her here, and he'd be defying powers that could reach even into these remote mountains, with enough force to crush any resistance. But beneath the political calculations lay a simpler truth. He'd given his word, and a man's word was one of the few things in this world that belonged entirely to him. "No," he said finally. "You stay. We'll face whatever comes together." The fourth day brought the first test of Torvin's resolve, though it came in a form he hadn't expected. He was returning from his morning hunt when he spotted smoke rising from his chimney. Not the thin, controlled wisps that marked a properly tended fire, but the thick, rolling clouds that spoke of green wood or a hearth left unattended. His heart hammered against his ribs as he broke into a run, images of Freydis captured or worse flashing through his mind. He burst through his cabin door to find her kneeling before the hearth, tears streaming down her soot-stained face as she tried to coax flame from a pile of damp kindling. The morning's cool air had chilled the cabin enough that she'd attempted to rebuild the fire from scratch. But her inexperience with the particular quirks of his chimney had turned the simple task into a smoky disaster. "The wood won't catch," she said, her voice thick with frustration and something deeper, the kind of helplessness that came from facing failure in skills that seemed basic to everyone else. "I've tried everything I could think of, but it just smolders and fills the room with smoke." Torvin set down his bow and the pair of rabbits he'd taken, then knelt beside her to assess the situation. She'd done everything correctly in theory, arranged the kindling properly, left space for air to flow, but she'd missed the subtle techniques that made the difference between success and frustration. His chimney drew poorly when the wind came from the west, requiring smaller pieces and a different arrangement to establish proper airflow. "Here," he said, gently moving her aside so he could rebuild the fire properly. "Watch how I layer these pieces. See how I leave gaps here and here? The fire needs to breathe, just like we do." As he worked, he found himself remembering teaching these same skills to Magnus during their last winter together. His son had been perhaps 7 years old, eager to help with grown-up tasks, but still lacking the patience that fire-building required. Torvin had shown him the same techniques he now demonstrated for Freydis, how to split kindling with the grain rather than against it, how to arrange fuel so that each piece supported the others while leaving space for air to flow. The memory should have brought pain, but instead it carried an unexpected warmth. For the first time since his loss, he found himself sharing knowledge that had once been passed from father to son, continuing a chain of practical wisdom that stretched back through generations of his family. "There," he said, as flames began to catch and spread through the carefully arranged wood. "The trick is patience. Most people try to add too much too quickly, smothering the flame before it has a chance to establish itself." Freydis watched the growing fire with the intensity of someone memorizing every detail. "I should have known this already," she said quietly. "A woman of my age should be able to tend a simple fire without making a mess of everything." "Learning takes time," Torvin replied, settling back on his heels to watch her face in the improving light. Skills that seem simple to those who know them are often the result of years of small failures and gradual improvements. "You'll master it with practice," she smiled then, the first genuine expression of pleasure he'd seen from her since her arrival. "You're kind to say so, though I suspect your patience might be tested if I fill your cabin with smoke every morning." "Then we'll practice until you get it right," he said, surprised by his own certainty. Better to learn properly once than to struggle with poor techniques for years. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze, the distant call of a horn echoing through the forest. Not the simple horn of a hunter signaling his location, but the complex pattern that marked organized men moving with purpose. 3 long blasts, followed by 2 short ones. Then silence. Freydis went pale, her hand instinctively moving to touch the hidden pouch at her waist. "They found the area," she whispered. "That's the signal my father's men use when they're searching systematically. They'll check every cabin, every cave, every place where someone might hide." Torvin felt the familiar coldness that had once preceded battle, the heightened awareness that came when danger shifted from possibility to certainty. "How long do we have?" "If they're being thorough, perhaps 2 hours before they reach this clearing. Less if they're pushing hard, or if they have local guides who know the paths." He nodded, his mind already working through their options. They could run, abandoning the cabin and everything he'd built to seek shelter deeper in the mountains. But winter was coming, and survival in the high country required preparations they hadn't made and supplies they couldn't carry. More importantly, running would only delay the confrontation rather than resolve it. "We stay," he decided, "but we prepare for the possibility that talking won't be enough to convince them to leave peacefully." Freydis stared at him as if he'd suggested they sprout wings and fly. "You don't understand what you're saying. These men serve the crown directly. They have authority that supersedes any local law, and they'll have numbers and equipment that—" "I understand perfectly," Torvin interrupted, rising to check the edge on his axe. "I also understand that some fights are worth having, regardless of the odds. They want you badly enough to hunt you across 3 provinces. That tells me they're not planning to treat you gently once they have you back." The look she gave him was complex. Gratitude mixed with fear, and something that might have been wonder. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why risk everything for someone you barely know?" Torvin paused in his examination of the axe's edge, considering her question. The honest answer was complicated, involving losses and loneliness, and the way her presence had reminded him what it felt like to have someone depend on his protection. But simpler truths sometimes served better than complex ones. "Because it's right," he said finally. "And because I've had enough of standing by while people with power crush those without it." Another horn call echoed through the trees, closer now and answered by a second horn from a different direction. The hunters were spreading out, surrounding the area to prevent their quarry from slipping past their search. "Help me with this," Torvin said, moving toward a section of floorboards near the eastern wall. He pried up 3 boards to reveal a shallow space beneath, not large enough for a person, but adequate for hiding valuables, or supplies that needed protection from thieves or fire. He reached into the space and withdrew an object wrapped in oiled leather, a war hammer whose iron head bore the subtle patterns that marked masterwork craftsmanship. Unlike his axe, which showed the wear of constant use, this weapon had been carefully maintained, but rarely employed. Its handle felt strange in his hands after so many years of honest labor, but the weight distribution was exactly as he remembered. "What is that?" Freydis asked, though her tone suggested she recognized a weapon designed for war rather than work. "Insurance," Torvin replied, testing the hammer's balance with a few practice swings. "Sometimes the threat of violence prevents the need for actual violence." And sometimes it doesn't, but you're better prepared when talk fails. The Warhammer had a name too, Skullcrusher, though he'd never been fond of the title his warband brothers had given it. The weapon had served him through 7 campaigns, crushing armor and breaking shield walls when lesser weapons would have failed. It was a tool designed for killing armored men, and he'd grown skilled enough in its use to earn both fear and respect from enemies who'd thought his size made him slow and clumsy. "They'll be here soon," he said, wrapping the hammer in its leather covering, but keeping it close at hand. "When they arrive, let me do the talking. Say nothing unless I specifically ask you to speak. Sometimes silence serves better than truth, and we'll need every advantage we can manage." The sound of approaching horses reached them before the riders came into view, the careful clip-clop of mounts picking their way along forest paths not meant for cavalry. Torvin positioned himself on his bench with studied casualness, the wrapped warhammer resting against the cabin wall within easy reach but out of immediate sight. Freydis had retreated inside at his instruction, though he could feel her watching through the gaps in the shuttered window. 5 men emerged from the tree line, their gear and bearing marking them as professional soldiers rather than local militia or hired thugs. They wore mail beneath leather jerkins, carried swords that showed the careful maintenance of weapons that might be needed without warning, and moved with the coordinated precision of men who'd fought together before. Their leader, a grizzled veteran with iron-grey hair and scars that mapped a lifetime of violence, raised his hand to halt his companions at the edge of the clearing. "Hail, woodsman," the leader called, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Captain Ragnar Thorson, in service to Earl Magnus the Red. We seek word of a woman who may have passed this way, young, dark-haired, traveling alone and on foot." Torvin nodded politely, making no move to rise from his bench. "Hail and well met, Captain. I am Torvin Eriksson. Few travelers pass through these woods, especially women traveling without escort. When did this person supposedly come through?" "Within the last 4 days," Ragnar replied, dismounting to approach on foot while his men remained mounted and alert. "She's wanted for questioning regarding matters that concern the Earl's household. There's a substantial reward for information leading to her recovery." The captain's careful word choices weren't lost on Torvin. "Wanted for questioning rather than accused of crime. Recovery rather than capture." The language suggested someone trying to maintain legal pretenses while conducting what amounted to a manhunt. It also confirmed that they had no specific evidence placing Freydis in this area. They were searching systematically rather than following a clear trail. "Substantial how?" Torvin asked, allowing curiosity to color his tone. A man living this far from civilization doesn't often hear talk of rewards. Ragnar's expression shifted slightly, revealing calculation behind the professional courtesy. 50 silver pieces for her safe return. Enough to change a man's circumstances considerably. "Indeed it would," Torvin agreed, though inwardly he noted the careful phrasing again. "Safe return, not simple capture. Someone wanted Freydis back unharmed, which suggested value beyond mere punishment for defying arranged marriage. Might I ask what this woman is accused of?" 50 pieces is bounty hunter money, the kind offered for killers and thieves. "She's accused of nothing," Ragnar said quickly, then caught himself and modified his answer. "That is to say, the Earl wishes to speak with her about private family matters. Her father is concerned for her welfare." The lie came smoothly, but not smoothly enough. Torvin had heard too many battlefield lies to miss the tells. The slight pause, the modified statement, the way Ragnar's hand shifted unconsciously toward his sword hilt when speaking of family matters. Whatever Freydis had done by fleeing her wedding, the consequences reached far beyond paternal concern. "I see," Torvin said neutrally. "And you believe she came this way because—" "We've tracked her movements from village to village," one of Ragnar's men interjected, earning a sharp look from his captain. "Trail goes cold near Ironwood, but the general direction suggests she's heading for the high passes." "Eriksson," Ragnar continued, regaining control of the conversation, "you strike me as a practical man. 50 pieces would buy land, livestock, enough supplies to last several winters. All for simple information about a woman who means nothing to you. Torvin considered the offer with every appearance of serious thought, though his mind was actually cataloguing the positioning of the mounted soldiers and estimating distances to cover. 4 men, still on horseback, spread in a loose semicircle that would make it difficult for anyone to flee the clearing without being ridden down. The captain had positioned himself within sword range, but not so close as to seem threatening. Professional work, suggesting they'd done this before. It's a generous offer, he admitted. But I'm afraid I can't help you. I've seen no travelers in the past week, man or woman. The hunting's been poor lately, so I've spent most days checking snares along the deer paths. I would have noticed anyone passing through. Ragnar studied Torvin's face with the intensity of a man whose life had depended on reading others accurately. You're certain? No sign of passage? Footprints, disturbed vegetation, abandoned campsites? Nothing, Torvin said firmly. Though if you're concerned about someone heading for the high passes, you might want to check the old logging road that runs along Whitecrest Ridge. It's the most direct route to the mountain villages, and there are caves along that path where someone could shelter if weather turned bad. The misdirection was subtle, but potentially valuable. Whitecrest Ridge lay a day's hard ride to the north, and the caves he'd mentioned were real enough to stand up to initial investigation. It might buy them time if the searchers decided to follow the lead rather than continuing their systematic sweep of the area. Captain Ragnar nodded slowly, though his expression remained skeptical. We may investigate that path. But first, I wonder if I might trouble you for some water for our horses. It's been a long ride, and we have far to go before dark. The request was polite, but not really a request. A way of extending their stay to observe more while maintaining the pretense of friendly interaction. Torvin recognized the technique and found himself impressed despite the circumstances. These men knew their business, of course, he replied, rising from the bench with careful deliberation. The stream runs clear about 50 paces east of here. Your horses can drink their fill, and you're welcome to rest yourselves before continuing. As he moved toward the stream, Torvin caught the faintest sound from within his cabin, a soft scrape that might have been a mouse in the walls, or might have been someone shifting position to get a better view of the proceedings. He hoped Freydis had enough sense to remain hidden and silent, because one glimpse of her would end all pretense and turn this polite fiction into open conflict. Kind of you, Ragnar said, following Torvin toward the water while gesturing for his men to bring the horses forward. It's rare to find such hospitality in these remote areas. Most folk who live this far from civilization have reasons for avoiding. In contact with the Earl's men, the comment carried weight beyond its surface, meaning a subtle probe designed to gauge Torvin's reaction to the suggestion that he might be hiding something. He kept his expression neutral, while leading them to where the stream formed a natural pool deep enough for horses to drink easily. I've no quarrel with the Earl or his authority, Torvin replied. I simply prefer the quiet life. Too many years of other men's wars left me with little appetite for excitement. Ah, a veteran then, Ragnar said with evident interest. Which campaigns, if you don't mind my asking? The northern marches, mostly. 7 years following the warbands before I decided I'd had enough of sleeping on frozen ground and eating other men's cooking. Torvin watched the horses drink while keeping track of the soldiers through peripheral vision. You have the look of military experience yourself, Captain. 15 years in Earl Magnus's service, Ragnar confirmed. Before that, household guard for various lords who needed reliable swords. It's a hard life, but an honest one, assuming you live long enough to enjoy your savings. The conversation continued in this vein for several minutes, 2 veterans sharing the comfortable lies that men told about the nobility of military service. But beneath the surface pleasantries, Torvin could sense growing tension. Ragnar's questions were becoming more pointed, his observations more detailed. The captain was noting the quality of Torvin's cabin, the obvious skill of its construction, the expensive tools that spoke of resources beyond what a simple hermit should possess. Captain Ragnar's scrutiny intensified as his men watered their horses. his experienced eyes cataloguing details that didn't quite fit the story of a simple woodsman seeking solitude. He noted the precision of the cabin's construction, joints that spoke of masterwork carpentry, a roofline that suggested knowledge of engineering principles beyond common building techniques. The tools visible around the clearing showed quality that commanded high prices in any market, while the cleared garden space revealed planning and effort far beyond what one man would typically invest in temporary shelter. "You've built quite an impressive homestead here, Eriksson," Ragnar observed, his tone carefully neutral. "The craftsmanship suggests skills beyond what most soldiers acquire during their service years," Torvin shrugged, maintaining his relaxed posture despite growing awareness that the captain was assembling pieces of a puzzle that might reveal more than was safe. "A man learns many things during 7 years of campaign life. Engineers taught me about construction when we built siege works. Carpenters showed me joinery techniques during winter quarters. Knowledge accumulates if you pay attention and ask the right questions." "Indeed it does," Ragnar agreed, though his expression suggested he found the explanation incomplete. "Still, this represents considerable investment for someone seeking temporary refuge from the world's troubles. Most men who want to disappear choose locations that require less commitment to develop properly." The observation carried uncomfortable accuracy. Torvin had built his cabin and developed his clearing with the careful thoroughness of someone planning to stay permanently, not someone simply hiding until circumstances changed. The level of development suggested roots rather than retreat, commitment rather than temporary escape. "Perhaps I discovered that temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent ones," Torvin replied. "After enough years of moving from camp to camp, the appeal of building something solid grows considerable." One of Ragnar's men, a younger soldier with the lean build and restless energy of someone unused to extended conversation, cleared his throat to gain his captain's attention. "Sir, we should check the cabin interior before moving on. Standard procedure when searching for fugitives." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from damp wood, acrid and impossible to ignore. Torvin felt muscles tighten across his shoulders as he calculated distances and angles, preparing for the moment when polite fiction would give way to open conflict. 5 trained soldiers with the advantage of numbers and preparation against one man who hadn't fought seriously in 3 years. "That won't be necessary." "Hendrik," Ragnar said firmly, though his eyes remained fixed on Torvin's face. "We have no specific evidence that our quarry passed through this area, and Master Eriksson has been cooperative with our questions. Good relations with local residents serve the Earl's interests better than heavy-handed searches." The reprieve was temporary, and they all knew it. Ragnar was buying time to observe Torvin's reactions, looking for the tells that would confirm or deny his growing suspicions. The captain had noted the slight tension in Torvin's stance when Henrik suggested searching the cabin, had seen the way his hand shifted almost imperceptibly toward the wrapped weapon leaning against the wall. "However," Ragnar continued, "I would appreciate the opportunity to examine your stores and perhaps purchase some supplies for our journey. We have silver for fair trade, and it's been some time since we've had access to properly preserved meat or quality tools for maintaining our equipment." The request was reasonable on its surface, but carried implications that made refusal difficult without seeming suspicious. Torvin's stores were kept in the cabin where Freydis was hiding, making any interior inspection dangerous despite Ragnar's apparent willingness to frame it as commercial transaction rather than official search. "I'm afraid my stores are quite limited," Torvin said carefully. "I provision for one person through winter, not for feeding traveling soldiers. You'd likely find better supplies at the trading post near Ironwood, fresher goods and proper merchant prices rather than whatever a hermit might charge for his meager surplus." "Modest of you," Ragnar replied with a thin smile. "But experienced soldiers learn to recognize quality when they see it. Your rabbit snares show expert construction, and that smoking rack suggests you know proper preservation techniques." A few strips of well-prepared jerky would be worth premium prices to men who've been eating field rations. For the past week, the captain's persistence was beginning to feel less like friendly negotiation and more like methodical pressure designed to create openings for further investigation. Torvin recognized the technique from his own military experience. Apply reasonable requests in sequence until refusal became impossible without revealing the real reason for resistance. Very well, he conceded, knowing that continued refusal would only increase suspicion. But I'll need to check what I have available. Inventory is simple when you're feeding only yourself, but it requires actual examination to know what surplus exists. Ragnar nodded with satisfaction that confirmed Torvin's suspicion that this had been the captain's goal from the beginning. Excellent. Perhaps my men could assist with moving heavy items. We're accustomed to handling supplies efficiently. That won't be necessary, Torvin replied quickly. Storage areas in a hermit's cabin tend toward chaos rather than organization. Better to let me locate what's available without outsiders trying to navigate my particular system. As he moved toward the cabin door, Torvin found himself hoping that Freydis had found adequate concealment and possessed the discipline to remain absolutely still, regardless of what she heard. The space beneath the floorboards where he'd hidden his warhammer was large enough to hold a person if necessary, but only if they were willing to endure cramped discomfort without making any sound that might reveal their presence. He opened the door with deliberate casualness, stepping inside while leaving the entrance visible to the soldiers waiting outside. The cabin's interior appeared exactly as he'd left it, fire burning properly in the hearth, his simple furnishings arranged with the neat precision of someone who lived alone. No obvious signs of recent occupation by anyone other than himself, but subtle details told a different story to someone who knew what to look for. The fire burned perhaps a bit too well for wood that should have been dampened by morning's cool air. A second clay mug sat clean, but still slightly warm beside the hearth. Most tellingly, the pile of rabbit fur he'd been saving for winter mittens had been shifted slightly, creating a depression that suggested someone had used it as a cushion while sitting by the fire. Torvin moved with deliberate efficiency, gathering strips of jerky from the stores hanging near his chimney, while listening for any sound that might indicate Freydis's location. The silence was absolute, but he could sense her presence the way a hunter sensed watching eyes in seemingly empty forest. Quality work indeed. Ragnar's voice came from directly behind him, and Torvin turned to find the captain had entered the cabin, despite the implicit understanding that he would wait outside. Your preservation techniques are excellent. This jerky could last months without spoiling. Experience teaches useful skills, Torvin replied, though his attention was focused on Ragnar's position relative to the hidden compartment and the potential lines of movement if violence became necessary. The captain stood between him and his concealed warhammer, while armed soldiers waited just outside the door. Indeed it does, Ragnar agreed, his gaze sweeping the cabin's interior with professional thoroughness. A man learns many things during years of service. Combat skills, survival techniques, and perhaps most importantly, how to recognize when he's being lied to by someone who should know better. The accusation hung between them like a drawn blade, sharp and impossible to ignore. Torvin met Ragnar's stare with the steady gaze of a man who'd faced death often enough to recognize it wearing different faces. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing closer as both men calculated distances and angles, weapons and advantages. "Strong words from a guest in my home, Captain," Torvin said quietly. "Perhaps you'd care to be more specific about these lies you think you've detected." Ragnar smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "The fire burns too well for wood that should be cold. There's a second mug by your hearth, still warm from recent use. Your rabbit furs have been disturbed by someone sitting beside your fire this morning. Small details, but they paint a clear picture for someone who knows how to read sign. I tend my fire well and drink tea twice each morning," Torvin replied, though he knew the explanations sounded thin even to his own ears. "As for the furs, I use them for comfort when the stones grow cold against an old man's bones." "Perhaps," Ragnar conceded, "but there's something else that troubles me more than domestic arrangements." He stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "I know your name, Torvin Eriksson. Not from village gossip or casual mention, but from military records that crossed my desk years ago." The words hit Torvin like a physical blow, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. His military service had been conducted under a different name in different regions, specifically to avoid the kind of recognition that could complicate civilian life. Yet somehow this captain had connected identities that should have remained separate. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Torvin said. But even as the words left his mouth, he could see from Ragnar's expression that denial would serve no purpose. "Torvin the Phantom," Ragnar continued, his voice carrying the weight of certain knowledge. "Leader of the most effective deep raid unit in the northern campaigns. The man who took 17 Saxon villages in one season without losing a single soldier under his command. The warrior who disappeared from active service after the Battle of Ironwood Bridge, leaving behind commendations for valor and a reputation that made his name legend among professional soldiers. The revelation struck deeper than fear or anger. It cut to the heart of the identity Torvin had tried so hard to leave behind. He'd chosen this isolated valley specifically because no one here would know his war name or the deeds that had earned it. For 3 years, he'd been simply Torvin the Hermit, a man who chopped wood and tended gardens and wanted nothing more than to be left in peace. "That man died at Ironwood Bridge," Torvin said quietly. "What you see before you is someone else entirely, a man who learned that victories taste like ashes when you've paid for them with everything that matters." "Noble sentiments," Ragnar replied. "But skills like yours don't simply disappear because a man grows tired of using them. Which brings me to my real concern. If the famous Phantom has chosen to hide a fugitive from the crown, then this situation is far more complex than a simple matter of a runaway daughter." The captain's analysis was uncomfortably accurate. A common hermit harboring Freydis might be bought or intimidated into cooperation, but a legendary warrior making the same choice suggested political implications that reached far beyond personal kindness or simple sympathy for a young woman in distress. "You're thinking like a soldier rather than a man," Torvin observed. "Sometimes people help others simply because it's the right thing to do, not because they're part of some larger conspiracy against royal authority." "Perhaps," Ragnar said, though his tone suggested he found such explanations naive. "But Earl Magnus doesn't pay me to believe in the basic goodness of human nature. He pays me to recover his daughter and return her safely to fulfill obligations that serve the crown's interests." It was then that Freydis herself resolved the standoff in the most unexpected way possible. She emerged from the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards with the fluid grace of someone who'd been waiting for exactly the right moment to act. But instead of the desperate fugitive both men expected, she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of nobility, back straight, chin raised, every movement speaking of authority that came from birth rather than circumstance. More shocking still was the object she held in her hands. Not the leather pouch with its royal seals, but a scroll case made of silver and ivory, its surface inscribed with symbols that made Captain Ragnar step backward in obvious recognition. "Captain Thorson," she said, her voice carrying none of the uncertainty that had marked her conversations with Torvin. "You may stand down. I am Freydis Magnusdóttir, and I carry direct orders from His Majesty King Harold himself." Ragnar's hand dropped away from his sword as if the hilt had suddenly become red-hot. The scroll case she held was unmistakable. Royal dispatches were carried in such containers, and the seals marking its surface could be forged only at the cost of one's life. But more important than the physical evidence was the fundamental change in Freydis herself. Gone was the frightened refugee who'd appeared on Torvin's bench. In her place stood someone who commanded respect through presence alone. "My lady," Ragnar said, dropping to one knee in formal recognition. "Forgive me. I was told you had fled your father's house against his will. I was sent to bring you home for your own protection. You were told what my father chose to tell you. Freydis replied, her tone carrying gentle rebuke rather than anger. The truth is somewhat more complex than familial concern for a wayward daughter. She broke the seals on the scroll case with practiced ease, withdrawing a document that bore the unmistakable hand of royal scribes and the heavy wax seal that marked communications from the throne itself. Ragnar accepted it with hands that trembled slightly as he recognized the magnitude of what he was seeing. As the captain read, his expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something approaching awe. The document was lengthy, but its essential message became clear through the changing emotions that played across his weathered features. "This is," he began, then stopped, apparently unsure how to complete the thought. "A royal commission," Freydis confirmed. "His Majesty has long suspected that certain members of his court have been using arranged marriages to consolidate power in ways that threaten the stability of the realm. My supposed flight from an unwanted wedding was actually an elaborate investigation designed to expose the network of nobles who have been manipulating royal policy through carefully orchestrated family alliances." Torvin found himself staring at this woman he'd thought he was rescuing, trying to reconcile the frightened refugee who'd sought shelter on his bench with the composed agent of royal will who now stood before them. Every interaction they'd shared, every moment of apparent vulnerability, every story she'd told about fleeing forced marriage, all of it had been carefully crafted performance designed to serve purposes far more complex than he'd imagined. "The man I was supposed to marry," Freydis continued, "Lord Canute of the Eastern Marches, has been gathering political alliances through strategic weddings, while secretly negotiating with foreign powers who seek to destabilize King Harold's reign. My father suspected but lacked proof. This investigation was designed to provide that evidence. And did you find it?" Ragnar asked. Though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, Freydis smiled with satisfaction that spoke of a mission accomplished. "Lord Canute's reaction to my disappearance exceeded our most optimistic expectations. In his desperation to recover me and the political alliance my marriage would represent, he revealed connections to Saxon gold and promises of military support that constitute clear treason against the crown." The revelation reframed everything Torvin had witnessed over the past days. The substantial bounty offered for Freydis's return hadn't been motivated by paternal concern or even political necessity. It had been panic from conspirators who realized their plans were unraveling. The careful organization of the search parties, the resources devoted to finding one runaway daughter, all of it made sense when viewed through the lens of treason rather than family drama. "Which brings us to our current situation," Freydis said, turning her attention to Torvin with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Master Eriksson has unknowingly provided exactly the kind of safe haven that allowed this investigation to succeed. His protection has given me time to gather the final evidence needed to complete His Majesty's commission." Torvin felt as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted fundamentally, revealing depths he'd never suspected. The woman he'd thought he was protecting had actually been protecting herself quite effectively, using his isolation and his protective instincts to serve purposes that reached into the highest levels of royal politics. "So what happens now?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate his life far beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd offered shelter to a stranger. The weight of revelation settled over the cabin like morning fog, thick and disorienting. Torvin found himself studying Freydis with new eyes, searching for signs of the deception that had fooled him so completely. Yet even knowing the truth, he could see how expertly she'd played her role, the genuine exhaustion from days of travel, the real fear when speaking of pursuit, the authentic gratitude when he'd offered shelter. The best lies, he realized, were built around kernels of truth. "Now," Freydis said, her tone shifting to something more formal as she resumed her role as royal agent. We must prepare for the final phase of this operation. Lord Canute's men will arrive within the day, probably before tomorrow's dawn. They've been following Captain Ragnar's search pattern at a distance, waiting to see if official channels would locate me before they were forced to take more direct action. Ragnar looked up from the Royal Commission, his expression troubled. My lady, with respect, my men and I were not briefed on this operation. We've been conducting a genuine search based on information provided by your father. If Lord Canute's forces are moving independently, then you and your soldiers are in as much danger as Master Eriksson and myself. Freydis finished. Canute cannot afford to let witnesses survive who might report his involvement in treasonous activities. 5 of the king's men disappearing while searching for a runaway daughter could be explained as unfortunate accident. Their deaths would remove inconvenient observers while allowing Canute to claim he had no knowledge of their fate. The tactical situation was becoming clear, and none of it painted an encouraging picture. Torvin's remote cabin, which had seemed like a refuge, was about to become a battleground between royal agents and traitors who possessed superior numbers and the advantage of choosing when to attack. The isolation that had protected him for 3 years was now a liability. Help was days away, and no one would notice sounds of battle in these deep woods. How many men will Canute send? Torvin asked, his mind already shifting into the strategic thinking that had served him during his military years. Perhaps a dozen, Freydis replied. Enough to ensure success, but not so many as to draw attention if they're spotted traveling together. Professional soldiers rather than noble volunteers, men who understand that some missions require absolute discretion. Mercenaries, Ragnar said with distaste. Foreign sellswords who care nothing for king or country, only for payment and the promise that their actions won't be traced back to their employer. Torvin walked to his window, studying the clearing and the forest beyond with eyes that hadn't considered defensive positions in years. The cabin sat in terrain that offered both advantages and vulnerabilities. Open ground that would force attackers to approach across exposed space, but also limited escape routes if defense proved impossible. The stream provided water but also noise that could mask the approach of skilled infiltrators. We have perhaps 18 hours to prepare, he said, his voice taking on the authority that had once commanded respect from hardened warriors. 5 men with advance warning against a dozen attackers who think they're facing unprepared opponents. The odds aren't favorable, but they're not impossible either. You're talking about making a stand, Ragnar observed. Fighting rather than fleeing, while we still have the option. I'm talking about using the advantages we possess while we still possess them, Torvin corrected. Running would mean abandoning prepared positions and supplies for uncertain prospects in terrain that favors pursuers with horses. Here we know every tree and stone. We can prepare defenses and force them to attack on our terms. Freydis studied him with renewed interest, seeing past the hermit persona to the military commander beneath. The Royal Commission grants me authority to conscript local resources for the Crown's service. If you're willing to fight, Master Eriksson, your service would be officially recognized and compensated. I'm not interested in compensation, Torvin replied, though something in her formal tone stirred memories of older loyalties. But I am interested in protecting what's mine and seeing justice served to men who think noble. Birth gives them license to commit treason. The next several hours passed in intensive preparation as 5 people transformed a simple homestead into a defensive position. Ragnar's men proved themselves capable soldiers, following Torvin's directions with the professional competence of veterans who understood that survival often depended on rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. They began by improving the natural defensive features of the site. The cabin's eastern and western walls were reinforced with additional logs cut from deadfall and positioned to provide firing ports for arrows while maintaining structural integrity. The northern approach, which offered the most concealment for attackers, was obstructed with carefully placed obstacles, fallen trees arranged to channel movement toward prepared killing zones, hidden snares that would slow advancing enemies and alert defenders to their approach. The stream became part of their defensive plan rather than a vulnerability. Torvin and two of Ragnar's men diverted its flow to create muddy, uncertain footing along the southern approach, while using the original channel to establish a secondary defensive position that could serve as fallback if the cabin became untenable. Weapons and ammunition received careful attention. Ragnar's men carried standard military equipment, swords, mail, crossbows, with sufficient bolts for sustained fighting. Torvin contributed his hunting bow, along with arrows designed for taking large game, their broad heads capable of punching through light armor if properly placed. Most importantly, he retrieved Skullcrusher from its hiding place, the Warhammer's familiar weight feeling both strange and comfortingly natural in his hands. Freydis surprised them all by producing a curved dagger from some hidden sheath within her dress. Not a decorative piece, but a working weapon with edges honed to razor sharpness. When questioned, she demonstrated knife fighting, techniques that spoke of serious training rather than courtly accomplishments. Royal agents are expected to be capable of protecting themselves, she explained when Ragnar expressed amazement at her competence. The king's service requires skills that aren't taught in most noble households. As afternoon faded toward evening, they completed their preparations with the establishment of watch schedules and communication signals. The cabin's interior was rearranged to provide maximum protection for wounded, while maintaining clear fields of fire through the reinforced walls. Emergency supplies were cached at the fallback position near the stream, including medical materials and enough food to sustain wounded defenders if siege became necessary. Torvin found himself settling into tactical thinking with an ease that was both disturbing and reassuring. The skills he'd tried to leave behind came back with clarity that made the intervening years seem like a brief pause rather than fundamental change. Yet alongside the familiar competence came awareness of how much he'd changed. The man who'd once led raids for gold and glory was now fighting to protect innocence and serve justice rather than personal ambition. "You're enjoying this," Freydis observed as they completed final checks on their defensive positions. "Or perhaps not enjoying, but feeling more alive than you have in years." Torvin considered her words while testing the tension on a tripwire that would alert them to movement along the eastern approach. "There's satisfaction in using old skills for worthy purposes," he admitted. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to fight for something that mattered beyond personal survival." "And what happens after?" she asked. "If we survive tomorrow's battle, what becomes of Torvin the Hermit, who turns out to be Torvin the Phantom?" It was a question he'd been avoiding, even as it pressed against his consciousness like a persistent ache. The life he'd built in these mountains was founded on anonymity that would be impossible to maintain once this affair concluded. Word would spread that the legendary warrior still lived, still possessed the skills that had made his name feared and respected across 3 kingdoms. "I suppose that depends partly on what His Majesty requires from his subjects," Torvin replied carefully, "and partly on whether there's still room in this world for a man who wants nothing more than to tend his garden and split his firewood in peace." Freydis smiled with something that might have been sympathy. "There's always room for good men, Master Eriksson. The question is whether good men can find room for the world's needs when those needs become unavoidable." Night fell with the clarity that comes before storm. Stars, bright and air, still in ways that seemed to promise violence with the dawn. They maintained watch in shifts, each person taking responsibility for observing specific approaches, while the others caught what rest they could before battle. Torvin found sleep impossible despite his exhaustion, his mind cycling through tactical considerations and contingency plans, with the obsessive attention to detail that had once kept his men alive through impossible odds. During the last watch before dawn, as he studied the forest for signs of approaching enemies, he realized that regardless of what tomorrow brought, his life had already changed irrevocably. The hermit who'd offered shelter to a stranger was gone, replaced by something he'd thought he'd left. Buried at Ironwood Bridge, a warrior with cause enough to fight and skill enough to make that fight matter. Dawn would bring answers to questions he'd stopped asking years ago, whether he was still the man he'd tried to become, or whether he remained the man he'd tried to leave behind, would be settled by steel and blood and the choices he made when violence became unavoidable. The attack came with the first grey light of dawn, announced, not by the clash of steel, but by the soft thrum of crossbow bolts striking wood. Torvin rolled from his position near the cabin's eastern window as splinters exploded from the wall where his head had been moments before. The enemy had positioned archers in the tree line, their opening volley designed to pin the defenders while assault teams moved into position. "Contact east and north," Ragnar called quietly from his position, covering the cabin's rear approach. "Count 8, possibly more in reserve." Torvin had expected the opening moves. Professional soldiers would probe defenses before committing to full assault. What surprised him was the quality of their coordination. These weren't common mercenaries, but experienced warriors who moved with the fluid precision of men, accustomed to working together under fire. A crossbow bolt punched through the reinforced wall near Freydis's position, the iron point emerging 6 inches into the cabin's interior. She shifted smoothly to better cover without the panic that might have seized someone unused to violence, confirming Torvin's growing respect for her training and composure. "They're testing our positions," he called to the others, "trying to map our defensive arrangements before the real assault begins. Hold fire until you have clear targets. Arrows are precious and these men won't expose themselves carelessly." The wisdom of his words proved immediate as one of Ragnar's men loosed a crossbow bolt at movement in the undergrowth, only to strike nothing more valuable than a cloak draped over a branch. The enemy was using classic light infantry tactics, creating the illusion of targets while their real forces maneuvered into more advantageous positions. Torvin studied the forest through gaps in the reinforced wall, reading the subtle signs that spoke of organized movement. A branch that swayed against the wind's direction, shadows that shifted in patterns, suggesting human passage rather than natural motion. The barely audible sound of equipment carefully muffled, but not entirely silent. 2 teams, he announced, his analysis confirming tactical doctrine he'd learned years ago. One group holds our attention with ranged harassment, while the second moves to assault positions. They'll hit us from multiple directions simultaneously to prevent coordinated defense. A new sound reached them, the soft whistle that marked incoming arrows rather than crossbow bolts. Someone in the enemy force carried a hunting bow, its missiles faster and quieter than mechanical weapons. The arrow struck the cabin's door with force enough to punch through the thick oak, its point emerging into the interior space like an uninvited guest. "Movement south," one of Ragnar's men reported. 3 figures advancing along the stream bed. That approach had been anticipated. The diverted water created uncertain footing that would slow attackers, while exposing them to crossfire from prepared positions. Torvin shifted to a window that commanded the southern approach, his own bow ready with an arrow designed for hunting elk, broad-headed, and capable of dropping large targets with a single, well-placed shot. The first enemy to emerge from the stream bed moved with the fluid grace of someone trained in stealth operations, but the muddy ground betrayed him despite his skill. Torvin tracked his movement for 3 heartbeats before loosing his arrow, watching it take the man's center mass and drop him into the churned earth with finality that spoke of considerable experience in such matters. The fallen man's companions immediately shifted their approach, using his body as cover while returning fire with crossbows, whose bolts struck the cabin walls with increasing accuracy. These weren't panicked recruits, but professionals who adapted quickly to changing tactical situations. "First blood to us," Ragnar observed with grim satisfaction. "But they're learning our capabilities faster than I'd like." The truth of his assessment became clear moments later when the forest erupted with coordinated violence. The feint along the southern approach had served its purpose. while defenders focused on the streambed assault. The main force had positioned themselves for simultaneous attacks from 3 directions. Crossbow bolts filled the air like deadly rain, forcing everyone inside the cabin to seek cover, while assault teams advanced across open ground. Torvin caught glimpses of mail-clad figures moving with purposeful speed toward positions that would allow them to storm the reinforced entrance. "Here they come," he called, abandoning his bow for Skullcrusher, as the sound of running feet announced the final phase of the assault. The cabin door exploded inward under the impact of a warhammer wielded by someone who understood the weapon's proper application. Wood and iron scattered across the interior as armed figures poured through the breach, their weapons ready and their movements coordinated despite the chaos of forced entry. Torvin met the first attacker with Skullcrusher's iron head, the impact crushing mail and ribs with equal efficiency. The man dropped without a sound, but his companion was already pressing forward with a sword that glittered in the dawn light, filtering through smoke and dust. Steel rang against iron as Torvin parried the sword thrust, his warhammer's longer reach, allowing him to control distance while seeking openings for counterattack. The enemy swordsman was skilled. His blade work spoke of years of professional training, but he'd never faced a master of Skullcrusher's devastating potential. The hammer's return stroke took the swordsman in the shoulder, crushing bone and mail together while spinning him into the wall with force that left no doubt about the outcome. Yet even as that threat ended, 2 more attackers pushed through the breach, their weapons ready and their eyes fixed on targets that would end this fight quickly. "Freydis, get down!" Ragnar shouted as crossbow bolts continued to pour through the shattered doorway. The royal agent had drawn her curved dagger but remained dangerously exposed to ranged fire while trying to support the melee combat that was rapidly filling the cabin's limited space. Torvin found himself fighting in the cramped quarters where Skullcrusher's reach became a liability rather than advantage. He shifted tactics, using the hammer's weight and balance for close-quarters combat that required different techniques than open battlefield engagement. The battle reached its crescendo as more attackers poured through the breach, their numbers threatening to overwhelm the cramped cabin's defensive positions. Torvin fought with the fluid economy of motion that had made him legendary, but even legendary skills had limits when facing professional soldiers in confined quarters designed for living rather than warfare. A spear thrust caught him across the ribs, its point penetrating his leather jerkin but not deep enough to incapacitate. He responded with Skullcrusher's pommel, driving it into his attacker's face with force that shattered bone and sent the man tumbling backward into his companions. Yet for every enemy that fell, another seemed to take his place. Their coordinated assault, speaking of careful planning and superior numbers. Ragnar and his men fought with desperate efficiency at the cabin's rear. Their crossbows useless in close quarters, but their swords serving well enough against attackers who'd expected to face unprepared hermits rather than trained soldiers. One of the royal guards went down with a sword through his shoulder, blood spreading across mail that had deflected death but not injury. "Fall back to secondary positions," Torvin commanded, recognizing that the cabin's interior would soon become untenable. "Execute withdrawal by sections, covering fire while the wounded retreat to the stream." The maneuver required discipline under pressure, something that separated professional soldiers from enthusiastic amateurs. Ragnar's remaining men provided crossbow fire through the reinforced windows, while Torvin and the wounded soldier moved toward the cabin's rear exit. Their withdrawal, covered by measured volleys that forced attackers to seek shelter rather than pursue immediately. Freydis moved with them, her curved dagger bloody from close work that spoke of skills beyond courtly training. She'd taken a cut across her left forearm, but showed no signs of the shock that often accompanied a person's first taste of serious violence. Royal agents, Torvin reflected, were apparently prepared for more than diplomatic negotiations. The retreat to the streambed positions proved more difficult than anticipated. Enemy archers maintained pressure from the tree line, their arrows forcing the defenders to move in short rushes between available cover. More concerning was evidence that the attacking force included reserves who were now moving to cut off retreat routes that had seemed secure during planning. "Contact west," one of Ragnar's men called as figures emerged from forest cover that should have been empty. "Four more, moving to flank our fallback position." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had begun as a defensive battle, fought from prepared positions, was becoming a running engagement against superior numbers who possessed both local knowledge and coordinated strategy. Torvin found himself reassessing options that all seemed to lead toward outcomes he preferred not to contemplate. Yet as they reached the secondary defensive position near the stream, fortune provided an unexpected advantage. The enemy's assault had been planned around storming a single building rather than fighting through multiple defensive lines. Their momentum was designed for breakthrough rather than sustained engagement, leaving them momentarily disorganized as they attempted to adapt to changed circumstances. "They're regrouping," Fridas observed, studying the enemy positions with tactical awareness that continued to impress. Professional soldiers, but not used to this kind of improvised fighting. "They expected to overwhelm us quickly." Torvin nodded, recognizing the same signs she'd noted. The attackers were skilled, but had committed to a specific tactical approach that required modification when faced with organized resistance. That hesitation, brief though it might be, offered opportunities for defenders who could act decisively. "Ragnar," he called to the captain, who was applying field dressing to his wounded soldier's shoulder. "How quickly can your men move if we abandon heavy equipment?" "Immediately," came the reply. "But abandoning positions means giving up our defensive advantages. These men will run us down in open country." "Not if we're not running away," Torvin said, his mind settling on a plan that carried substantial risk but offered better prospects than passive defense. "They've committed most of their force to storming positions we're about to abandon. That leaves their command element exposed, while they're focused on clearing empty ground." Understanding dawned in Ragnar's expression. "Counterattack while they're engaged with abandoned positions." "Exactly. 5 minutes to let them commit fully to clearing the cabin. Then we strike their leadership while they're scattered and overconfident." Torvin hefted Skullcrusher, feeling the weapon's familiar weight settle into his hands with deadly purpose. End this fight by removing their ability to coordinate further operations. The plan was simple in concept, but required precise timing and considerable courage from people who were already wounded and exhausted. Yet as Torvin looked at the faces around him, he saw not defeated defenders, but soldiers who understood that bold action sometimes offered better survival prospects than cautious retreat. 2 minutes, he announced, watching enemy figures advance cautiously toward the cabin they'd just abandoned. "Then we remind these mercenaries why professional soldiers earn their reputation through deed rather than gold." The stream ran red with blood from earlier fighting, but it would run redder still before the sun climbed much higher. Some battles were won through superior position or better equipment, but others required the kind of personal courage that transformed desperate circumstances into unexpected victory. Dawn was breaking fully now, painting the forest in shades of gold that seemed oddly peaceful for ground that had become a battlefield. Yet beauty and violence often shared the same moments, and this morning would be remembered for both before it ended. The counterattack succeeded beyond Torvin's most optimistic expectations. The enemy commander, a scarred veteran who'd grown overconfident during the cabin assault, never saw Skullcrusher coming until iron met skull with finality that ended all resistance. His death broke the mercenaries' coordination like a snapped bowstring, transforming organized soldiers into scattered individuals whose only thought was escape rather than completing their mission. By mid-morning, the forest had returned to its accustomed quiet. 7 enemy dead lay scattered across ground that would remember this battle long after the blood soaked into autumn earth. The survivors had fled toward distant roads, Their contract with Lord Canute effectively terminated by circumstances that made further pursuit impossible. Ragnar's wounded soldier would live, though his sword arm would never again serve with full strength. The captain himself bore cuts that spoke of close work, but nothing that threatened life or long-term capability. Freydis's arm required careful binding, but the wound was clean and showed no signs of the infection that turned minor injuries into major complications. Torvin found himself relatively unscathed despite bearing the brunt of close combat. A few cuts, some bruising that would remind him of the morning's work for days to come, but nothing that would prevent him from returning to the ordinary tasks that defined his chosen life. Yet as he surveyed the aftermath of violence that had erupted in his carefully maintained sanctuary, he wondered whether such ordinary tasks remained possible. "The royal commission is completed," Freydis announced as they gathered around the rebuilt fire in his partially destroyed cabin. "Lord Canute's treasonous activities are now beyond denial. His hired soldiers attacked the king's agent while she carried official dispatches, witnessed by Captain Ragnar and his men. No court in the kingdom could ignore such evidence. What happens to him?" Torvin asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Execution, most likely," Ragnar replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd seen justice administered according to royal decree. "Treason carries only one penalty for nobles who should have known better. His lands will be forfeit. His family stripped of titles and holdings." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders, moving at speed rather than the careful pace of hunters searching unknown territory. Torvin reached for weapons that were never far from hand, but Freydis raised a restraining gesture. "Royal messengers," she explained, pointing toward banners that had become visible through the trees. "I sent word yesterday that the investigation would conclude today." His Majesty's response has arrived with admirable promptness. The messenger party numbered 12 riders, their equipment and bearing marking them as elite royal guards rather than common soldiers. Their leader, a man whose grey beard spoke of decades in royal service, dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who lived most of his life in the saddle. "Lady Freydis," he called formally, though his tone carried warmth that suggested personal familiarity. "His Majesty commands your immediate return to court. The evidence you've gathered requires prompt attention from those authorized to act upon treasonous activities." "Of course." "Commander," she replied, then turned toward Torvin with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "However, I believe His Majesty would also be interested in meeting the man whose assistance proved instrumental in completing this mission successfully." The suggestion carried weight beyond casual recommendation. Royal audiences were not granted lightly, and the implications of such recognition could fundamentally alter a man's life in ways both rewarding and burdensome. Torvin found himself torn between curiosity about royal gratitude and concern about the obligations such attention might bring. "I'm honored by the suggestion," he said carefully, "but I'm not certain that royal notice serves my interests or his. Majesties, some men are better suited to quiet service than court appearances." Freydis smiled with understanding that acknowledged his concerns while suggesting alternatives he hadn't considered. "There are many ways to serve the crown, Master Eriksson. Not all of them require abandoning the life you've chosen here. His Majesty values loyal subjects who possess useful skills, regardless of whether those subjects seek recognition or prefer anonymity." The offer hung between them like morning mist, present but insubstantial, carrying possibilities that could reshape his future or leave it fundamentally unchanged, depending on choices he hadn't yet made. Torvin studied the royal messenger's face, reading signs of respect that suggested his reputation had preceded any formal introduction. "Perhaps," he said finally, "there's room for discussion about what forms such service might take." 3 weeks later, Torvin stood again on his bench, watching dawn paint the forest in shades of gold and green that spoke of winter's slow approach. His cabin bore new timber where battle damage had required repairs, but the scars were already weathering into character that suggested struggle overcome rather than defeat endured. The leather satchel that rested beside him contained documents that formalized arrangements he'd never expected to make. Royal recognition for service rendered, a pension that would ensure his independence regardless of hunting success or crop failures, and most importantly, a commission that would call upon his skills only when circumstances made his particular expertise genuinely necessary. He would remain Torvin the Hermit for most purposes, tending his garden and splitting his wood in the peace he'd sought when he first came to these mountains. But he would also be available when the crown required someone who could handle situations that demanded both military skill and absolute discretion. It was, he reflected, a balance that honored both the man he'd been and the man he'd chosen to become. The bench beside him held memories now, of a stranger who'd needed help, of choices that had seemed simple but proved complex, of violence that had reminded him what he was capable of defending. Some people, he'd learned, were worth protecting regardless of personal cost. Some causes were worth fighting for even when fighting meant abandoning the safety of isolation. Winter would come soon, bringing its familiar challenges and comfortable routines. But this winter would be different, marked by the knowledge that he was no longer entirely alone in the world. Somewhere in royal halls, people knew his name and valued his service. Somewhere in the kingdom, justice had been served partly through his efforts. It was enough. More than enough for a man who'd once thought his useful days were finished. The silence of dawn felt welcoming now rather than empty, promising peace but not loneliness. Purpose but not obligation beyond his choosing. The greatest treasures, after all, were often found not in what we sought, but in what found us when we were brave enough to open our doors to unexpected possibilities.